ever seen in my life.
No, I'm just hurry.
Cuffs. I start.
Talk about 4 topics for APUSH review. We're the day before the test. We're going to talk about new versus old immigration. We're going to talk about 1790s foreign policy. We're going to talk about Reconstruction. And then we're going to look at AMSCO. And if we have time, we're going to talk about 1848 to 1890 in the West, because there's a lot of layers there. And that was the best guess of the woman on TikTok. So why not do that? So first, new versus old immigration. And I'm really going to chart immigration into 4 sections just so we can get a greater area. Immigration happens in 4 sections, okay? Colonial, old, new. It's funny because it's new, but it's not new. And then sort of modern, which isn't really a title, which is 1925-ish to today. And really, 1965 becomes a key year, and I'll talk about why. Now, if we have an essay in LEQ, I'm inclined to think that it will be comparing these two, okay? They fit within a time frame that makes sense for the second of the 3 LEQs, all right? So if there's an LEQ on immigration as a subject, I'm inclined to think that it'll be these 2. So I'm only going to briefly talk about the end dates. Colonial is 1607 to 1775-ish. That's the Revolution. These are English people. Over 2/3 are English. And then Africans against their will end up being 1/5. And then the rest, which ends up, if we do percentages, if that's 67 and that's 20, the other 13%-ish, or 1/8, is a mix of Scotch-Irish, French Huguenots, Swedes, Dutch, and some random other Europeans. That's this era, colonial, okay? You know the reasons they came in colonial? There were push and pull factors, religious persecution, or they're looking for like financial stability, or they were dragged here through slavery, okay? Most are coming from Europe, except the Africans. They came through the triangular trade in the Middle Passage. Let's focus on these other 2 areas because it's often the compare and contrast. So colonial's time frame is from the Revolution, 1775, really to about 1870s-ish. And what we see in this period is still a lot of English people, of course, but we also see the Scandinavian, and that's Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Finland. We see that. We see some French. We see some Germanic people, a little bit, and we see the Irish, because in the 1840s they had a potato famine. Okay? This is these groups. These are Northern and Western Europeans. These are, other than the Irish, Protestants. White Anglo-Saxon Protestants, or WASPs as they're called. They assimilated, that means blended, very easily. Okay? They became a part of the, quote, American culture. Much easier than what we see when the Industrial Revolution happens and the drastic change in immigration that takes place in new. This is where we see Southern and Eastern Europeans, who in some cases even look physically different. This is where we see Poles and Ukrainians and different, like Greeks. Italians are a big one in this region. And so we're seeing a shift. Slavs come, and Croats, and Serbians, and all these different groups from Eastern Europe. They're coming here for jobs because of the American Industrial Revolution. And most of these are Catholic, Roman Catholic. So like the Irish, they face discrimination. The time frame is the 1870s to when the immigration restrictions in the Quota Acts of the 1920s happened. They did not assimilate as well. They culturally clustered in cities, even Auburn and Syracuse, but also New York City most notably, because not only their Catholicism wasn't as individualistic, but they joined these different clubs like the Knights of Columbus and the Ancient Order of the Hibernians, and they were a part of a lot more. They held their own ethnicity. So we see a shift in theory from a melting pot and blending to more of tossing a salad in the salad bowl theory in cultural pluralism. And a lot more discrimination's faced, and these are a lot more cities. This is why Jane Addams needed the Hull House. And we see this whole city shift. And the progressive era had to fix all the issues of the cities because they became overcrowded and filthy. What we saw is some of these ethnic groups, the Italians, become a big part of New York City, and the Irish a big part of Boston and New York City. And we see these groups cluster. The Poles and the Ukrainians and those people become a big part of Chicago. So our cities start to get these clustered new immigration groups because they wanted to be with people like themselves because they didn't fit in as well. One other caveat, the Chinese came in this era, and they were a part of the first congressional legislation called the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. So we actually discriminated against the Chinese. And later, the Gentleman's Agreement in 1806 or 1906, 1907, where we told Japanese immigrants we stopped them coming here. And that was something with Teddy Roosevelt. So we do see a little what we would say was racism using today's standards against the Chinese and Japanese. Now, modern immigration, in 1920s, we see quotas that say immigrants can only come from certain places, and we see an Origins Act that people can only come from certain places in a certain amount. And until 1965, that's where we see that we open up immigration from all around the world. In this era, this is where you see Southeast Asia, Africa, the Middle East, the Caribbean, South and Central America. You don't have to write all these down. And still Europe. Or basically everywhere. So we see a big shift. Okay? We see a big shift to where immigration comes from. That's immigration. My guess is the essay, if it was asked, would be this. But just to get a good idea of immigration, that's the history of American immigration. Any questions? Okay, we're going to move on to a second topic. And you want to take a picture of that, you can. I mean, it's a little sloppy. I'll give you a second if that's something you're interested in. You can message me on Remind to Translate it if you need me to. It's like Kennedy said in the Berlin Wall speech, I appreciate somebody translating his German, which is funny because the German translator, because he butchered it so much, he's like, I need my German to be translated from the German translator into German. And that was a funny joke. You could quote that in a Kennedy essay. There you go. Okay, second thing, 1790s. 1790. Oh, that's not a good pen. 1790s foreign policy. Before we do that, we need to talk context. In the 1780s, foreign policy was weak because the Articles of Confederation were weak and we didn't have a president, okay? So countries exploited us. They built forts in the West, England. We couldn't stop them. We couldn't pay off war debts. The big three European countries in the 1780s, France, England, and Spain, we did not get respect from. Now, the Constitution sets up a stronger federal government. And when it's ratified in 1789, we have our first president, George Washington. Washington becomes the cornerstone of American foreign policy, particularly through his proclamation of neutrality in 1793 in his farewell address when he said goodbye in 1796, okay? Well, let's talk about Washington. What were his advice for the farewell address? Well, he advised against political parties, too late, and he advised against sectionalism, going to cause a civil war. But as far as foreign policy, and he was right on both those things, as far as foreign policy, Washington said to steer clear, this is his exact words, of permanent alliances. And what he means by that is, don't enter into agreements with France or you're going to make an enemy of England. And don't enter into agreements with England or alliances or you're going to make an enemy of France. And either way, we're too young and new of a country to get into any kind of permanent alliances. So Washington will be leveraged even 120 years later. Congressmen like Henry Cabot Lodge will say, I don't want to join the League of Nations. Washington said steer clear of these alliances. So think about that. We're still talking about Washington's farewell address in 1919, arguing over ratifying the Versailles Treaty. That's the power of Washington's farewell address. Obviously today, it's too late. We're in alliances with everybody. You know, Cold War forward, we had to join NATO. We had to join the UN. We're in a world of alliances now. It almost has become good versus bad. The other thing Washington warned against was avoiding European entanglements, which is basically don't get involved in European problems. Adams, his successor, the second president, John Adams, would listen to Washington. Even though it would be France, who Adams' political party, the Federalists, hate. And people like Alexander Hamilton want Adams to send us to war with France. Instead, Adams is calling for diplomacy, conversation, because he said, I'm listening to Washington, we're too new. By doing that, he splits the Federalist Party, and it's a contributing factor to their dying. Okay? So let's talk about Adams and what he faced. Well, here's what happened. France is going through a revolution in the 1790s. The 1790s are a part of the French Revolution. We sign a treaty, Washington's administration, the Jay Treaty with Great Britain, and France is mad about it. So we're like, oh, you're mad that we're making a treaty with Britain? We're just trying to get some land stuff taken care of and run a functioning country. Don't be mad. Sit down at the table and talk to us. So they have these 2 or 3 XYZ affair, is what we call it. These 3 French diplomats, X, Y, and Z we call them, okay? And what that means is that they get the code name, they wouldn't sit and talk to us unless we paid them tribute. So they totally disrespected us, and Americans, particularly Federalists in the Northeast, were calling for war with France over this blatant disrespect. Like, they won't sit with us. And what ends up happening is they're impressing sailors already, and all this stuff is happening. And we're sort of fighting a quasi-war, it's called, which is a non-declared sort of naval engagement with France in the late 1800s, or 1700s, 18th century, in the late 1700s. But Adams avoids full-scale war with France, okay? A lot of this upsets people like Hamilton, because Hamilton's like, when Lafayette helped us, and if you know the Hamilton music, you know, Lafayette had our back in his time of need, now he needs us. And that's the argument that the Democrat Republicans make, that, you know, who's even in charge of France? They're not like a revolution, they're like a riot. Like, how are we even going to get involved with them? And yet, still, here we are, there's people pushing for us to war with France, but it never actually happens. Now, last thing, the Adams administration doesn't like dissension. And so they pass the Alien and Sedition Acts that jail people that talk about the federal government. Jefferson and Madison are on the sidelines, furious. Their states of Virginia and Kentucky pass resolutions that say these Alien and Sedition Acts go against the First Amendment. They're unconstitutional. It's freedom of speech. When Jefferson takes power, he gets rid of these because Americans, by and large, don't like these anti-immigrant and anti-talking about the government stuff that the Federalists passed. And a lot of this had to do with stuff with France. And just, they didn't like dissension. So that's sort of foreign policy. A little flash forward for context. Once the Democrat-Republicans take over, and Jefferson, Madison, and even Monroe, these are the third and fourth presidents. This is 1801 to 1817, these two presidents. The beef will be shifted to England, and it will be Great Britain, England, that we go to the War of 1812 with, not France. And Napoleon's in charge of France, but it'll be England that we actually go to war with, and not listen to Washington. And he's already dead, he died in 1799. That's the second topic. Third thing, motoring along here. You want to take a picture of that? You can. It's a little gibberish, but if that's something you want, now's your chance. Okay. Third topic. Lost my little list here, but I wanted to talk about, oh my God, I'm choking under pressure. What did I say I wanted to talk? I know what I want to talk about fourth. Reconstruction. Okay, so she thinks that Reconstruction could be an essay topic, and honestly, I'm hoping so. Because we spent a lot of time on Reconstruction. It was a choice on the midterm for some of you. Let's talk about it. The Civil War is the context. 1861 to 1865 is the Civil War. It is the midpoint in the American story. It changed us in many ways, not just because 600, 700, 800,000 lives were lost, more than every other war combined, but because it really changed the way we look at our country. After the Civil War, or even during it, when the North knew that they were going to win, we had to start to talk about how we would allow the South back in. And different politicians had different views. So Lincoln is still alive, and Lincoln wants to welcome the South back without a lot of punishment. So almost welcome them back kindly. If they make some provisions, a 10% loyalty oath, let's heal. Let's move forward. But Lincoln dies. His successor, number 17, Andrew Johnson, is hated by the Republicans in Congress. He didn't have the clout that Lincoln had. So he also wants to treat the Southerners kindly, but he's a white Southerner and a racist, using today's term. So of course he wants to let the white Southerners back in graciously. Congress doesn't like him. And they're going to take over the Reconstruction plan. So the plan that happens is the radical Republicans in Congress are going to set up Reconstruction from 1865 to 1877, but really 1867 is when the program passes. We're going to have Reconstruction in the South through the entire Grant administration, the 18th president. Not that Grant was an effective president, like he was an effective war leader. He was actually, and remember this, folks, if it's a question tomorrow, Grant's administration was riddled with scandal, and so was Harding later. Those are scandal-filled. Question, Ella.
Is that a 2 or a 7?
1865 to 1877.
No, the one below it.
1867.
Okay.
That's when the Congressional Reconstruction Act was passed. It was in 1867. And you're probably like, what's that? That's this. Where they...
What's that? I think it's the U.S. But that's just personal. Are you sure about that?
Where they split the South into 5 military zones.
Definitely.
It's not to scale. It's a horrible map, but for sake of time, We split the South into 5 military zones. Did Reconstruction help African Americans? While it happened, it did. While the U.S. military was overseeing the South, we saw 9 African Americans voted into Congress. Once it ended in 1877, for the next 100 years, how many Southern African Americans were voted into Congress? 0. Part of the problem with Reconstruction is that in its time, it was good, but it didn't help African Americans long term. You could make a point that what it would have helped African Americans would be to give them land from the former slave owners. In hindsight, that would have been the best do-over if you want to make that objective analysis in an essay question.
It's sort of irrelevant, but for like the 5 sections, was it the National Guard or Army that was like...
I think it was a little bit of both. I think it was the United States military, but I do think that they would have sent guardsmen in too and oversaw it. You know, Virginia was its own, and I believe Texas was its own, or Texas and Louisiana, and then the others were split into thirds, 3. That's not to scale my map. And what they did was they set up an organization called the Freedmen's Bureau. And what that meant was they tried to help the free men transition into society. And the response by the racist white Southerners were black codes, where they said blacks couldn't testify in a trial if they were witness to a white person crime, and they said that, you know, blacks couldn't own property. Now, all these racist codes that punished throughout the South. So we got black codes as a response to the Freedmen's Bureau. We also see a hate organization called the Ku Klux Klan that starts underground in Tennessee because, you know, they can't do this stuff out in the open, spread their hate, because there's an oversight. Once Reconstruction ends, then things turn very ugly because the South becomes riddled by Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws are laws of legal segregation. In the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, in 1896, with Homer Plessy on the train, said that laws of legal segregation were okay. So it upheld it. It wouldn't be till Brown v. Board in 1954 that it reduces it. Now, how did they keep African Americans from getting voted into Congress? By things like literacy tests, poll taxes, and the ridiculous grandfather clause. So the South becomes a place of sharecropping. The South becomes really a horrible place for African Americans. It's why by 1910 to 1940, the African Americans are a part of the Great Migration out of the South to cities. That's the African American. Eventually, they have to get out of the South because the South is so backward. You know, even when Jackie Robinson breaks the color barrier, he's still not welcome in the South in 1947. You know, where do you think Dr. King is doing these protests and marches against, you know, the bus laws and all? It's all in the South. So Reconstruction is a good intentioned era, but when it ends, things go back to, in many ways, as bad as they always were. The last thing is, how did Reconstruction end? Reconstruction ended with the Compromise of 1877. And what that was the election of Hayes, Rutherford B. Hayes, versus Tilden. And this is some shady stuff. Hayes is the Republican. He'll be the 18th president, or 19th president. Sorry. He'll be the 19th president. That's a 9. And Tilden is the Democrat. He's the New York governor that gets screwed here. Because to get a Republican in the White House, what they did was sort of cheat the Electoral College. Tilden had 184, Hayes had 165, and there were 20 disputed electoral votes from Louisiana, South Carolina, Florida, and Oregon. And all 20 went to Hayes to give him 185 in the White House, and the Southerners got in return the end of Reconstruction and a railroad built. And to them that was amazing because once the oversight was gone, they could go back to treating African Americans horribly, which was ultimately the goal. And unfortunately, an effect of maybe the failures of Reconstruction, although obviously Reconstruction was good intentioned. Okay, last thing. Last few minutes. I'm going to grab AMSCO quick because if you're researching, I want to make sure that you know where this stuff is because it jumps through topics. But the lady thought that it could be 1848 to 1890, the West. This encompasses, wow, that was all sorts of colors. This, unfortunately, is going to take you from topic 4, and if you got your book out right now, I'm in XII in the beginning. It's going to take you from learning target or topic 4, where it kind of talks about a little bit at the end of Southern society and talks a little bit about slavery, but really it's going to be all of 5, where it's going to talk about manifest destiny in 5.2, which is the belief that we deserved all the land from coast to coast, manifest destiny in the Mexican-American War, which ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. That's why 1848's that day. Hidalgo. And that is 5.3, 5.2 and 5.3 gets into that. That leads to 5.4, which is the Compromise of 1850, which is a result of what do we do with the land in the West and slavery. And that becomes the issue. What do we do with slavery with the land that we took in the West? This is going to become the story of the West, along with gold and silver strikes. And that's going to lead a lot of whites going west. That's where California and Nevada and these places, Wyoming. So that's where we see the story of the Old West. One of the problems is they encounter American Indians. And so if you look, now we're jumping into Unit 6, Topic 6.2, and that's part of the problem, if there's an essay on this, is all about Western expansion, transcontinental railroads in the last of the West. So, and then 6.3, Western culture. So if you're going to review this, like this lady said, this is a lot. This is a lot. And it's 5.2, 5.3, 5.4, and then maybe more importantly, 6.2 and 6.3, which is, you know, that area where you're going to talk about railroads, talk about Indian wars, the Battle of Little Bighorn, the death of Sitting Bull, Wounded Knee, the Ghost Dance movement. Helen Hunt Jackson writes a book called A Century of Dishonor. We really treat the American Indians terribly in this era. White settlers push westward. Population increases in the westward. Farmers try to organize in the West, and plains farmers, and we see this whole like transcontinental system that helps draw people out there. And it ends with the closing of the frontier and that Frederick Jackson Turner frontier thesis. So those are 4 possible essay topics. Again, this video, if you want to go back, new versus old immigration and all of immigration, 1790s foreign policy, Reconstruction, and then the West. Thank you.
And good night.
Do I not get a shout out?
Sophia,
For
filming.
It's my
Thank you.
birthday.
Ella's birthday.